December 7, 1941. Battleship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay, Japan. The morning mist hung heavy and cool over the dark waters of the inland sea, but inside the flagship's main communication center, the air was hot and thick with the smell of sweat, ozone, and stale cigarette smoke. For days, the crew of the Nagato, the very symbol of Imperial Japanese naval power, had been operating on a razor's edge of anticipation. The tension had been building for months, years even, culminating in this single, shattering moment thousands of miles away. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, did not pace. He sat, a small, disciplined figure with a broad, intelligent forehead and eyes that seemed to hold the cold, immense space of the Pacific Ocean itself. He had been a student at Harvard and a naval attaché in Washington. He knew the enemy, perhaps better than anyone else in the Imperial General Headquarters. That knowledge now was a heavy cloak. Yamamoto held a teacup, its ceramic warm, against his fingers, but he hadn't taken a sip in 20 minutes. He was waiting for the final conclusive cipher, the confirmation that his meticulously planned, high-risk gamble had paid off. The primary strikes were over, the radio waves already humming with the initial, fragmented reports filtering back from the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, currently hundreds of miles north of the island of Oahu. His Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Ryanosuke, stood ready by the map table, a finger tracing the phantom movements of the six carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, that had launched the devastating strike. The silence in the room was not empty. It was pressurized, filled with the ghosts of 70 torpedo planes, 135 dive bombers, and 45 fighter escorts that had roared through the Hawaiian dawn. Finally, the chief radio operator, Petty Officer First Class Kenjiro, snapped to attention. He held a deciphered message, short, brutal, and glorious for the Empire. It contained the initial battle damage assessment. 8 American battleships targeted. 4 sunk, the rest severely damaged. Airfields were ablaze. The American Pacific Fleet was, for the moment, crippled. A wave of audible relief and quiet elation swept the room. For many of the officers, this was it, the knockout blow, the stunning victory that would force a negotiated peace on terms favorable to Japan, securing the Pacific Empire for decades. Admiral Kasaka permitted himself a thin, almost fearful smile. Yamamoto nodded, a single measured movement that acknowledged the enormity of the news without celebrating it. He raised the teacup, finally, and took a slow sip of the cold tea. His own words, written months before to a colleague, echoed in his memory. It would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. He had warned his peers that a short war was the only feasible path for Japan. He knew America's colossal industrial potential, its bottomless reserves of manpower and raw materials, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the assembly lines of Detroit. He was the only one who saw the immediate victory as merely the first, tiny tick on a doomsday clock. The operation was successful, Yamamoto said, his voice low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of triumph, pulling the attention of every man in the war room. But I take no satisfaction from it. What is the status of the repair facilities? The oil storage tanks? Was the primary objective truly neutralized? The junior officers exchanged uneasy glances. Yamamoto wasn't asking about sunk ships. He was asking about infrastructure, the sinews of America's ability to fight a long war. The reports confirmed that while the battleships were burning hulks, the dry docks were mostly intact, and crucially, the massive, above-ground oil storage facilities were untouched. The American aircraft carriers, the true future of naval warfare, had, by an act of supreme historical misfortune for Japan, been out at sea. The strategic success was only partial. The psychological effect, however, was incalculable. Yamamoto pushed himself back from the table. His mind wasn't on the smoldering ruins of Battleship Row. It was on the factory floors, the shipyards, the training camps that would soon be springing to life across the American mainland. His famous, chilling premonition, later dramatized for film and history, captured his true, immediate fear. He spoke quietly, not to the officers, but to the cold steel of the flagship, I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. The true battle, he knew, had not been won this morning. It had only just begun. The giant was stirring. The sleeping giant was not merely a poetic flourish. It was a cold, quantitative assessment based on Yamamoto's deep understanding of the United States industrial base, an understanding woefully lacking in the military zealots of the Imperial Army General Staff, IGS. Yamamoto knew that Japan's success hinged entirely on the speed and severity of its initial operations. The entire strategic concept, the raison d'etre of the Pearl Harbor strike, was predicated on the short war doctrine. Japan simply lacked the material, manpower, and resource depth to sustain a protracted conflict with the behemoth across the Pacific. To grasp Yamamoto's deep-seated anxiety, one must look at the raw statistics he carried in his mind. In 1941, the United States was producing over $2,000 worth of goods per capita, while Japan produced only about $275. More critically, the gap in steel production, the very measure of industrial war-making capacity, was astronomical. American steel production stood at over 60 million tons annually, dwarfing Japan's meager 7 million tons. This wasn't a gap, it was a chasm. Yamamoto, an astute strategist and a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, understood that numbers like these, not initial battlefield victories, dictated the final outcome of a total war. He had famously articulated this to Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono in 1940. He could promise victory for the first 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that, he had utterly no confidence. The military leaders in Tokyo, however, suffered from what historians would later call victory disease. They operated under the assumption of Japanese spiritual power, seishin shugi, the belief that the inherent moral superiority, indomitable spirit, and warrior ethos of the Japanese soldier and sailor could somehow negate the overwhelming material superiority of the enemy. They envisioned America, a nation they viewed as materialistic and soft, suing for peace once its initial fleet was shattered and its morale broken. They believed that by creating an impregnable defensive perimeter, stretching from the Aleutians to Burma and deep into the South Pacific, they could bleed the Americans into accepting a stalemate. But Yamamoto saw beyond the immediate euphoria of December 7th. He saw the American response through the lens of history, knowing that an unprovoked attack on home soil, especially one targeting sailors asleep in their bunks, would not break the American will. It would forge it into something harder than any Japanese sword. Already, the news reaching the Nagato confirmed his fears. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech had unified a deeply divided nation almost instantly. Isolationism evaporated like morning dew. The immense, sleeping factories of the American heartland were about to be converted, at dizzying speed, into arsenals of democracy. Yamamoto's strategy was thus a desperate, high-stakes attempt to buy time. The 6 months of unhindered expansion were meant to establish a perimeter, so strong that when America finally brought its industrial might to bear, the cost of breaching it would be too high. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be the stunning opening that provided the empire breathing room. But by failing to hit the oil stores and the dockyards, and by missing the carriers, the Kido Butai had ensured that the giant would wake up faster, stronger, and far angrier than anyone in Tokyo had calculated. The architect of the attack realized in the cold light of that December morning that the 6-month clock was already running, and the strategic objective had been missed by mere meters and minutes. The clock was ticking toward the inevitable reckoning. Yamamoto's dread was not based on prophecy, but on personal, first-hand observation of the nation he had just provoked. He had lived among Americans, understood their pragmatism, and knew that once mobilized, their economy was an unstoppable force. The American commitment to industrial warfare began almost immediately after the attack, fueled by the terrible resolve Yamamoto so feared. The scale of the mobilization was unprecedented, a transition from peacetime production to total war that would redefine global manufacturing capability. The transformation was astonishingly rapid. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, the titans of the American automotive industry, immediately ceased producing cars and began churning out tanks, aircraft, and military vehicles. The massive Ford River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, which once birthed the Model T, became a cradle of war machines. Even more impactful was the construction of a Willow Run bomber plant, a marvel of engineering overseen by Henry Ford. By 1944, this single factory was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The statistics read like science fiction to the Japanese General Staff. In 1940, the U.S. produced 6,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that number exploded to nearly 96,000. The shipbuilding yards mirrored this frantic pace. The Kaiser shipyards, employing Henry J. Kaiser's revolutionary modular construction techniques, drastically cut the time required to build a Liberty ship, the backbone of the Allied supply chain, from months to mere weeks. By 1943, a new Liberty ship could be launched in as little as 42 days. America's shipyards collectively produced a staggering 5,000 naval and merchant vessels during the war. Yamamoto, a dedicated proponent of naval aviation and carrier doctrine, must have tracked these numbers with a sinking heart. Japan could not replace its carrier losses quickly. America was building a whole new fleet before the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor. This colossal shift was codified by the War Production Board (WPB) and the full implementation of the Victory program, which projected the necessary output to overwhelm the Axis powers. Yamamoto, recalling his January 1941 letter, had anticipated the sacrifices required for a decisive Japanese victory, but he also accurately judged the American capacity for self-sacrifice and total commitment once galvanized. This resolve was manifested not just in the sheer volume of steel and aluminum, but in the millions of new workers, the riveters, who streamed into the factories, dramatically expanding the industrial workforce. As 1942 dawned, while Japan was busy seizing Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, and Singapore, the very territorial gains that were supposed to confirm the short war victory, Yamamoto knew that every day of this success was merely allowing the giant across the ocean to forge a stronger, larger counterweapon. The material disparity was growing exponentially. For every ship Japan sank, America was building 10. For every plane lost, America was assembling 20. The 6-month window was closing fast, and soon, the overwhelming tide of American-made steel, oil, and lead would begin its inexorable rollback across the Pacific. The tactical victory at Pearl Harbor was quickly being overshadowed by the strategic defeat that industrial mobilization was ensuring. As the American war machine roared to life, Yamamoto realized the fatal flaw in the initial plan. The 6-month grace period had to be shortened, or, failing that, the breathing room had to be drastically expanded. The string of early Japanese victories, from the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse to the fall of Singapore and the crushing success in the Java Sea, only solidified the Imperial Army's belief in the inevitability of total victory, making them resistant to Yamamoto's cautions. He knew the decisive battle had to happen now, before America's new fleets arrived. The strategic pivot was the Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Oahu, which served as a crucial sentinel for Hawaii. Yamamoto devised Operation MI, a complex, multi-pronged effort designed to lure the surviving American carriers, the Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, into a decisive engagement where the superior numbers of the combined fleet could destroy them. This plan, launched in late May 1942, represented the final, desperate lunge to deliver the crippling blow that Pearl Harbor had failed to achieve. By eliminating the U.S. carrier fleet, Yamamoto hoped to establish absolute naval supremacy for long enough to truly force a negotiated peace. He personally supervised the operation from his new flagship, the mighty battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, a floating symbol of the very traditional naval doctrine he was trying to supersede with air power. The planning was aggressive, perhaps overly confident, infected by the very victory disease he despised in his peers. He split his forces, assuming the Americans would be surprised and passive. However, the American forces, under the command of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, held a critical, unseen advantage: intelligence. Naval cryptographers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had cracked the main Imperial Japanese Navy code, JN-25B. They knew the target was AF, and through a brilliant ruse, sending a false message about Midway's water purifiers breaking down, which the Japanese intercepted, they confirmed AF was Midway. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the decisive action unfolded. The Japanese strike against Midway's air defenses was successful, but the crucial sequence of events that followed, poor communications, disastrous timing, and the American carriers lying in ambush, led to catastrophe. As Japanese deck crews were frantically rearming their planes, swapping anti-ground ordnance for anti-ship torpedoes, 3 American carriers launched their attacks. Within a mere 6 minutes, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown turned 3 of Japan's most prized carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, into roaring infernos. The 4th, Hiryu, was sunk later that day. The Battle of Midway was not just a defeat, it was a demographic collapse for the Imperial Navy. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and over 200 irreplaceable aircraft, along with hundreds of highly trained, veteran aircrews, a loss the country's limited pilot training structure could never fully recoup. Yamamoto, receiving the devastating updates aboard the Yamato, maintained his composure, but the magnitude of the disaster was clear. Midway, 6 months to the day after Pearl Harbor, smashed the strategic premise of the short war. The American terrible resolve, backed by the limitless output of the factories, had met the Japanese offensive thrust and violently broken it. The initiative was now permanently ceded to the sleeping giant, now fully awake and fighting. Following the disaster at Midway in June 1942, the war for the Japanese shifted irreversibly from offense to defense, exactly as Yamamoto had feared. The giant was not only awake but actively pushing back, seeking retribution for the sneak attack that started the conflict. The American industrial machine, hitting its stride, ensured that every Japanese loss was magnified by the speed of its replacement. The first great test of the American counterpunch came in the steamy, brutal hell of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning in August 1942. The fighting on Guadalcanal was a grinding, 6-month campaign that exemplified the new reality of the Pacific War, attrition. Japan poured men, ships, and planes into the meat grinder in a desperate attempt to retake Henderson Field, the crucial airstrip captured by the U.S. Marines. Yamamoto, still in command, authorized costly naval battles and Tokyo Express resupply runs, watching his remaining experienced forces dwindle. This was the long, slow, material-based war he had dreaded. For every Japanese soldier who died, America had replacements training by the thousands. For every Zero fighter shot down, American factories were spitting out multiple new F-4F Wildcats, and soon, the superior F-6F Hellcats. The numbers had begun their terrifying, predictable climb against Japan. By early 1943, Yamamoto felt the immense pressure of command in a war he knew was unwinnable. He embarked on an inspection tour of Japanese air bases in the Northern Solomons to boost the plummeting morale of the frontline units. This tour, intended as a gesture of leadership, would prove to be his final journey. His itinerary was fixed, detailed, and tragically intercepted. American cryptographers, who had provided the crucial edge at Midway, again read the most sensitive Japanese communications. They learned the precise dates, times, and routes of the Admiral's flight on April 18, 1943. The location of the architect of Pearl Harbor was known. April 18, 1943. Above Bougainville, Solomon Islands. At 9:43 a.m., the 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers carrying Yamamoto and his staff took off from Rabaul. Yamamoto was in the second bomber. Overhead, 6 escorting A-6M0 fighters weaved protectively. The weather was clear, the perfect canvas for the ambush planned by the Americans. U.S. Army Air Force P-38 Lightning fighters, codenamed Pappy by the American pilots, were already airborne, having flown 400 miles from Guadalcanal on a mission codenamed Operation Vengeance. At 9:58 a.m., the Lightnings, led by Major John Mitchell, intercepted the Japanese formation high over the dense jungle canopy of Bougainville. The air battle was swift and brutal. The P-38s, faster in a dive and carrying superior armament, focused their attack. Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, a decorated American pilot, engaged the second bomber carrying Yamamoto. Barber's 20mm cannon and .50 caliber machine guns tore into the Betty's wing and engine. The bomber, trailing thick black smoke, spiraled violently into the jungle. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who knew the cost of awakening the sleeping giant, was the ultimate act of retribution for Pearl Harbor, precise, overwhelming, and based on superior intelligence and technology. His fear expressed in the shadow of Pearl Harbor's flames had materialized. The giant was fully awake, resolved, and demanding a terrible price.